Chapter 8. A Harrowing Night. I had no sooner retired to my bedroom, the footsteps of the attentive Dooley fading down the hall, when I was so startled that I must have jumped a foot. Out of nowhere came a voice, and it took a moment to realize that it was a familiar one. "Is the coast clear, Gov?" As I stood petrified, Slim Gilligan assumed that my silence indicated an affirmative, and rolled out from under my bed. "Good heavens, Gilligan, what brings you here?" "Mr. Holmes wants you ready to move, Gov. He's got a nose for such things. He is as and tonight's the night." I did not bother asking the cracksman how he had gained my room. With his record, a country estate presented no problems. To my credit, I acted in a businesslike manner. "What's the plan?" "If you waits a bit till the master of the house has folded up shop, you're to go downstairs. Tell the butler that you want to take another turn round, and then nip out to the stables and saddle a couple of riding horses. Then you come back. See, and the butler, Dooley, he'll lock the place up for the night. You get into your riding togs and stand by. Mr. Holmes figures there's going to be a real hullabaloo during the night with a lot of running round, and you slips out in the confusion and gets the horses, ride round back and make for the main road, staying away from the tree line." "Then what?" "Just keep going away from the house, Mr. Holmes. Helia, is he here?" "Has been for a while. Good luck." Gilligan listened for a moment at the door and then slipped through it and was gone. I sat on the bed for a moment, my thoughts awhirl. Holmes had said that I would play an important part in the drama to unfold, and suddenly it seemed that I would. It struck me that this was the greatest miscasting of all times. Night alarms with a somewhat overweight medical man riding over the countryside like a supporter of the ill-fated Stuarts, fleeing from a company of Roundheads. Holmes's drama might be played out like a farce comedy. But the Watson spirit rose within me, and I banished such thoughts as self-defeating. Holmes had dressed me in the clothes of an adventurer, ready to take center stage, and I resolved to play the part with conviction, though I felt more like assuming Gilligan's hiding place under the bed, with a blanket over my head. After a suitable period, I walked jauntily down the great stairs of the mansion and made for the rear. In the butler's pantry adjacent to the huge kitchen, I found Dooley, who slipped a copy of La Vie Parisienne out of sight and took me to the rear door, which he unlocked for me. Outside in the bracing night air, I walked casually and apparently aimlessly until well removed from the house, and then made a beeline for the stables. None of the grooms were about, and I was able to secure the riding equipment from the tack room. Locating Fandango's stall, I spoke to the horse in a low tone and allowed her to get used to the idea of my presence before slipping a bridle on her. I then led her from the stall and arranged the saddle. There were sounds from the other horses, but I ignored them. Either I was going to pull this off undetected, or I was not. With the girth cinched tight around the mare, I secured her bridle in front of the next stall, figuring that the horse within, conscious of Fandango ready for action, would get the idea and accept the bit from my unfamiliar hands. Such proved the case, and with the two horses saddled, I returned them to their stalls to await their movement. I don't think my foray took more than 15 minutes, and when I tapped on the back door, Dooley opened it for me, indicating no suspicion. Feeling considerably the better for having accomplished the first part of my task, I returned to my bedroom and wondered what the signal for the second act would be. Seated in an armchair, I steeled myself for the waiting. Always the most difficult period in a situation like this. It had been such a short time ago that I had thought of the peaceful atmosphere in our snug quarters on Baker Street, and here I was in a Surrey mansion awaiting for who knew what in connection with the Deeds affair. It had begun like such a pedestrian matter. The introduction of our client's deceased father into the list of dramatis personae had added the fillip of dark and sinister motives. And what about the agent of Mycroft, who had died in our presence? This bizarre occurrence, combined with the invasion of our quarters, had been momentarily jettisoned, it would seem. Though I knew Holmes's manner too well not to accept the fact that the two cases had connective tissue, the association of all this with one John H. Watson in Surrey was remote indeed. But if Sherlock Holmes's nostrils had quivered, there was a scent in the air. My musings were suddenly interrupted with an energizing thought. My activities on this night had just begun, and I hastened to my feet to don my riding habit, on loan, to be ready for the action when it came. It did come finally, within a rush and a roar of sound that snapped me awake and out of the chair that I had been slumbering in. There were indistinguishable shouts, transformed to alarms by their tone of anguish and terror. There was a smell in the air, and for a ridiculous moment I thought it might be Holmes's pipe. But no, it was not the scent of his shag, but there was smoke. As I made for the stairs, it became more apparent. My God, it came from a conflagration, darting out the side entrance by the porte-cochere, it being the most readily at hand. I saw flames lighting up the night sky. They were at, or adjacent to, the horses' barns wherein the racers were stabled. Despite a tumult of sound and running footsteps, I was completely alone. Every man Jack on the place was at the fire, desperately trying to save the priceless thoroughbreds. I made an instinctive move to rush to join the rescuers, but Holmes's instructions came to mind in the nick of time, and I bolted to the stalls of the riding horses, somewhat removed from the center of activity. There were whinnies and neighs as I made my way to Fandango, for the horses, sensitive to the aura of excitement, nay, panic, were moving nervously in their places. Fortunately, the wind was such that the smell of the fire had not reached them, or they might have been unmanageable. My presence seemed to have a calming effect on the chestnut mare, and I led her from her stall and then secured the reins of her neighbor. When I mounted Fandango, the tenseness of the moment lent springs to my legs. With the other animal in tow, I urged the mare into motion. The moment we cleared the barn door, Fandango spied the not-so-distant flames. I was urging her in a direction that would take us around the country mansion, and she cooperated in a manner that jarred my back teeth. We swept by the house at a full gallop and thundered down the main road leading from Macewood. I had all I could do to hang on to the reins of our companion animal, who was in just as much of a hurry as my mount. I dropped my curb and was riding to the snaffle, and that was not true in a moment, for in desperation I dropped my bridle entirely and gripped the pommel of the saddle with one hand. For no reason, the name of the other horse flashed through my mind. Miss Cheek, she had been referred to. A suitable mount for Holmes, but Mother of Heaven, would I ever reach him? Out of the night loomed a complication. The white picket horse gate was closed across the driveway to Macewood, as it would be in the night hours. The gallant Fandango, flanked by Mystique, was bearing down on the obstacle at a speed that defied stopping in time. Nor were the reins in my hand to try it, or the strength in my arms to do it if they had been there. The gate, a low affair, assumed the proportions of a grand national hurdle as we thundered towards it, its white flanking touched by a spring moon that suddenly sailed free of high clouds, assumed a ghastly glow. To think that I, dedicated to the saving of life, was to end my days with a snapped neck or speared by a broken plank. Little did my dear departed mother picture my emulating one of the ill-fated riders of that desperate charge in the Crimea. The gate was upon us, still gripping the saddle with one hand and Miss Cheek's reins with the other. I instinctively leaned forward, as I had seen huntsmen do when clearing a stone wall in pursuit of the elusive fox. Then the thunder of hoofs ceased, and for a glorious moment I had the feeling of flying, soaring through the air as if in fulfillment of man's age-old dream. I was suspended in a nothingness as those two splendid horses with their muscles uncoiled, their legs outstretched, cleared the barrier in unison. Oh, it must have made a wondrous sight, which I never saw, for my eyes were screwed tightly shut and I was just hanging on for dear life, without even time for a fervent prayer. The moment of weightlessness passed with a crash as we made contact with the road beyond the gate. I was jarred to my heels and lost a stirrup, coming within an ace of losing my seat as well. Then by some miracle the loose iron snapped back over the toe of my riding boot, and I had the support of two legs, which allowed me to regain a portion of my balance. As though in relief at clearing the obstacle, Fandango slackened her headlong rush, and I was able to loosen my death hold. on the saddle and snatch at her flying reins. Leaning back in the saddle with the reins as support, I succeeded in slowing my mount and Mystique as well, even further, and it was then that I heard the call. "Watson, over here!" I saw Holmes in the semi-darkness waving a white handkerchief by the side of the road. I was so startled at hearing his voice, so amazed at even being alive, that a surge of unknown strength welled up within me. My left arm, which a moment ago had threatened to fall off, swung the reins to the right, and I leaned in that direction as well, throwing the head, neck, and withers of Fandango against Mystique, and somehow bringing both animals to a skidding, sliding halt right where Sherlock Holmes stood. The great sleuth grabbed Mystique's reins as I let them drop, securing the animal by the bit. He anchored Fandango in the same manner, all the time looking upward at me in complete amazement. The horses were sucking in air in great breaths, and their forequarters were lathered foamy white. Somehow my riding bowler was still on my head, though askew. I was as drenched and as breathless as the steeds, but managed to keep my backbone straight. Had I sagged a smidgen, I would have fallen headlong from the saddle like a sack of grain. The moment was tense and the situation critical, but Holmes stole time to gaze at me as though unsuspected vistas had suddenly been revealed to him. I have always contended that my intimate friend had the rare ability to seize a situation at a glance, to read the book of a happening in a fleeting second, but this time his instant appraisal deserted him. Watson, good fellow, were it possible for me to be rendered speechless, I'd be as mute as an oyster. That gate is fully 5 pegs high, and I could but think, as you came upon it, of a Cossack in full flight, and to clear it with not one horse but with two in perfect form. If deeds were to give you a mount, I'd place my wager on your colours, dear friend. I was goggle-eyed, but the sincere conviction of Holmes's words and the light in his eyes kept me from swaying. I could not and would not destroy an image nurtured, however incorrectly, in the mind of the kindest man I have ever known. I made a weak half gesture towards the breeding farm in the distance. "Holmes, Macewood is afire." "Naught but haystacks, old chap," replied Holmes, swinging into Mystique's saddle, sufficiently close to the stabled thoroughbreds to create a menace, but something that Deeds and his crew can handle. Come, let us observe the follow-up of this diversionary tactic. The sleuth reined Mystique from the road into the line of trees, and I had but little choice to follow his wake. Brushing through branches and bending low in the saddle to clear outstretched boughs, we made our way through the trees to a point at the end of the timberline that I assumed Holmes had scouted and chosen in advance. From there we commanded a fine view of the front of the mansion, The flames were dimly visible around the side of the residence, and the firefighters were still intent on their task. We were at our station but a moment when I spied at least four men who seemed to materialize from the ground before the house. There was a flash of metal in the air, and objects flew into the night sky to descend on the stone balustrade of the balcony. My thought of using grappling hooks was not amiss, Watson, whispered Holmes, as the shadowy figures tested their lines and then swarmed up them, hand over hand. What are they after, Holmes? Regard the balcony. What do you see? Five French windows? Then there enough. It is so true that one looks but does not see. That's American. Poe's concept of the purloined letter was accurate. Holmes, what are you think back to when we were within the gallery before walking out on the balcony? What is the picture that comes to your mind's eye, Watson? Well, we walked towards the four French windows and made our way. I stopped abruptly, shafted by a thought. Four windows? But five are staring me in the face. The fifth is a dummy. Look, they are making for it even now. In but a moment they will have the aperture open. The figures that had gained the balcony were doing as my friend said. Huddled around the fifth opening, there was a pause in their feverish activity, which allowed me to protest, to give vent to my mental rebellion. I assumed it is a door to a secret chamber, Holmes, but why not have it concealed? Because someone's eye wandering over the face of the building would note an unusual distance from the real window on the end to the windows of adjacent rooms. They would wonder where all that space was, how it was used. As it is, you see a charming exterior in proposition and note the openings, but do not count them. From the inside, things have a different perspective. You cannot consider a room you occupy in conjunction with adjacent ones. But when we went out on the balcony, did you notice anything unusual? Your eye was captured by the view. There were windows behind you. How many you did not count. You walked right past the false one, never conscious of the fact that you were passing an entry to a vault, a hiding place for whatever treasures Captain Spaulding brought back from his expeditions. You noticed it, of course. Ah, Watson, I have trained myself to look and to see as well. Aha! They've forced the door. Two of the figures on the balcony suddenly disappeared within the house. The third posted himself by the real windows. The remaining one went to the edge of the area at the side of the building nearest the fire, as a lookout should anyone note something amiss. Apparently confident that their arrival was undiscovered, as it certainly was, both men on the balcony then moved to the balustrade. Loosening the grappling hooks, they passed each one over the railing and dropped it to the ground. It was a recreation of Holmes's suppositions several days before. Suddenly I tightened my hold on the reins, lifting Fandango's head as though in preparation for a charge. This, then, is what Dietz feared, that his uninvited visitor would suspect the location of the family vault. "We must stop them, Holmes." My friend's lean and sinewy arm reached out to grasp me by the shoulder and pull me back in my saddle. "Hold tight, Watson. We have not planned this so carefully to stop them. We want to see what they do." "Do? They're after this ward. You were right about that, of course. If left to their devices, they will spirit it away." "Not so easily, good chap." I noted flashes of light from the interior of what we assumed was the Deeds's family vault. Gilligan and Styles are waiting on the Forlornsby Road, which is the only direct thoroughfare back to London. Holmes gestured to our left. "Now, there's a path in that direction, is there not? For I think the Chinese came from there." "Oh, they are Chinese, are they? Let me see." My mind raced back to my journeys round Macewood, and fortunately the mental pictures meshed in my mind. Yes, there is a good-sized lane running in a half-moon direction that way, I stated, pointing towards our left and rear. "It splits in a fork. One branch continues round by a bluff and curves back to the road to Lichfield. The other terminates at a railway assembly point down in a valley. Actually, there's a path down the bluff that reaches the same point much quicker. I chanced upon it." "Good show, Watson. In former times that Confederate cavalry genius, Jeb Stuart, might have grown fond of you. The junction you mention must be for making up freight trains for the run into the city. I suspect that is the key to the Chinaman's plan." His musings were interrupted by the reappearance of the men on the balcony of the Deeds's mansion. They were carrying something with them, though I could not make out its form. Had I to hazard a guess, I would have said it was a crated object. Holmes suddenly lost interest in the nocturnal attack squad. I noted they were securing the door they had forced, no doubt, seeking to delay the discovery of their thievery. Holmes swung Mystique to his left. "Take my horse's tail in your hand, Watson, and let us be as silent as possible." With some reservations I secured the end of Mystique's tail in my right hand, and leaning low in the saddle, let Holmes choose our route through the trees. The arrangement was efficient, since Holmes had uncanny night vision, which served him well on this occasion, as it had many times in the past. My position was an uncomfortable one, but it saved me from being brushed from my saddle by tree branches on at least two occasions. After a period of swerving round trunks, Holmes drew to a stop. I heard a cautionary "shush" from him, and then he was out of his saddle, passing Miss Cheek's reins to me. He was gone into Stygian darkness, for the trees blocked out the high-flying moon. My heart was pounding, half in reaction to what had been, and half in anticipation of what was to come, and I cannot say how long he was gone. Suddenly I was conscious of another presence, and felt Holmes retrieve his horse's bridle. I could make out his form dimly now, and he patted Miss Cheek encouragingly on the muzzle, and took Fandango by the bit, and led both animals in what I assumed was the general direction of Lichfield, though my directional sense was non-existent at this point. After another short period we came out of the woods. Standing by Fandango's forequarters, my friend posed a question. "Is this the lane you referred to?" In the added light of the clearing I looked up and down the country road and nodded. That path would be. I suddenly regained my confidence. A little light and visibility does have that effect on one. "Here, I'll show you." I urged Fandango forward as Holmes remounted and followed, hopeful of recognizing landmarks I had noted previously. I kept a sharp eye, and even then passed my objective. But the gleam of railroad tracks from the bluff reoriented me, and I backtracked to the opening by the roadside and the narrow trail that my mount and I traversed before. Holmes's hawk-like eyes had been sizing up the situation. "I may call you Pathfinder in the future, Watson." Forced by the trail to ride single file, I was unable to dazzle him with a retort, but then I could not think of one either. We had our hands full negotiating our passage, much more treacherous by night, I soon realized. At last we reached level ground, and the shadows of freight cars dotted the scene. But there was sound as well. A stationary locomotive puffed in readiness, and there was movement and sporadic conversation. I realized that a train was being built up, probably carrying agricultural produce for early morning delivery to the hungry metropolis. Holmes kept us in the shadows, and since we had come from a heavily wooded hillside by a thin and tortuous trail, I had no doubt that our presence was unsuspected. The locomotive suddenly sprang to life, moving backward, and there was a clang of metal as other freight cars were hooked on to a growing line. "What is our next move, Holmes?" "We have gained considerable time, which is fortunate. The Chinese had a delivery wagon on the roadway. With their cargo they are making for here by the branch road you mentioned, and the Sacred Sword will ride into London on the early morning freight, whilst they return via the Forlonsby road. It will mean that Gilligan and Styles are following a dead trail, but no matter." Holmes's voice dwindled away, and I shot him a quick glance, noting that his brow was furrowed. Then the lines disappeared, and he was looking at me with that boyish half-smile. "Merely anticipating, Watson. Do keep an eye caught for the delivery wagon, like a good chap. Again he dropped from the saddle and glided swiftly across the open ground toward the small building that seemed the nerve center of the junction. His movements reminded me of descriptive passages I had read regarding the American Indians' amazing ability to flit from one object to another when engaged in a stealthy approach. Fandango gave indications of a whinny, and I reached quickly forward, placing the palm of my hand over her nose. Really, that horse was most intelligent, and she curbed her desire to communicate. Then I saw, vaguely, a wagon coming round a bend in the distance. I hastily dismounted, holding both our steeds by their bits in an attempt to keep them silent. Suddenly Holmes was at my side. "If you ever wish to incriminate me, Watson, you have me dead to rights, for I have just stolen an object from the Great Eastern Railroad. I note our Chinese are on the scene, so let's get in the saddle once more." He was displaying a piece of marking chalk as he spoke. Standard equipment with freight handlers. I forestalled Holmes's move towards Mystique. "Look here, I've been leaping on and off for half the night, Holmes, or so it seems. Would you be kind enough to give me a leg up?" "Certainly," he replied, intertwining his long fingers with one toe in his hand cradle and his shoulder as a fulcrum. I managed to get astride of Fandango once more, as my friend swung upwards with a grace that was revolting. I saw the moon glisten on his white teeth, and realized that he was laughing at me, but his words brought me up short. "I've said before, Watson, that you occasionally display a pawky humor. I'm not fooled, you know, being convinced you are descended from Attila the Hun himself. So it is that reputations are born." With Holmes leading the way, we progressed a distance away from the junction but parallel to the rails that were the feeder to the main line. The Chinese have arranged to have their crate placed in one of the freight cars. Of that I am sure. The train is carrying naught but foodstuffs, so when the object is removed it should be readily spotted. However, we shall facilitate the process. Holmes had reined to a stop now and was looking back at the junction, and my eyes followed his. The wagon had drawn adjacent to one of the freight cars. Here in the valley the moonlight was quite bright, and I noted that an object about 4 feet in length was passed from the wagons to one of the railway roustabouts, who took it towards the line of freight cars. I looked at Holmes and realized that he was counting from the engine back. "The 12th freight car, Watson," he said happily. Of course he was enjoying the whole thing, as he always did, especially when he managed to keep one step ahead of the opposition. Now he reined round again, and we travelled further toward the main line, drawing to a halt in the shadow of a clump of small trees. We waited, and Then came the methodical and lugubrious chung of locomotive as it slowly gained momentum with the cars behind it jerking into motion like reluctant children making for school in single file. Every thrust of the steam-driven pistons increased the speed of the metal serpentine, and it was proceeding at a good rate when it passed our place of concealment. "Hold fast, good Watson," said Holmes as he broke from the trees, gigging Mystique to a fast gallop. I saw now that he had chosen the location carefully, for it was a stretch where the railroad was level with the adjacent ground. Without realizing it, I was counting cars, and then Holmes swerved his mount in close to the swiftly moving train, and leaning forward and out, he reached with one long arm to chalk an X on the 12th freight car. Then he guided his mount away from the train and raced for the shelter of the trees. As the train disappeared round a bend, I rejoined Holmes to find him patting his cheek with all the affection of a Highland horseman for his bonny steed. Now that the pace of our nocturnal adventures has diminished, you might explain to me what is going on, I suggested. Things are going swimmingly, and now we shall make our way to Lichfield. This freight makes frequent stops along the line. We can catch the 1 o'clock flyer from Lichfield and reach London before it. I assume we can follow the rails to the rural hamlet. I've done so. Capital. Upon arrival, you make for the station and secure tickets. I will rouse the cable office attendant, for a message must precede us to London. A message to Deeds will not be amiss if only to locate his horses for him. Not long thereafter I lowered myself gingerly into the seat of our compartment on the morning flyer, with a deep sigh of relief. Stretching my aching legs, I mentally forced strained and knotted muscles to relax. There was the familiar click of wheel on rail and trestle. At last we were headed back to London. Far more suitable surroundings for two staid, middle-aged bachelors, one of whom was intent on a steaming tub positively alive with Epsom salts. Holmes had been right, of course, about the schedule of the flyer now hurtling through a countryside covered by the blackness of night. The man's knowledge of trains, both in Britain and on the Continent, was positively encyclopedic, and I drowsily made mention of this. Ah, Watson, those ribbons of steel that are the wrap and woof of the tapestry of transportation so indispensable to the empire. At this point I fell asleep. It was Holmes's long, violinist fingers on my shoulders, shaking me gently, that summoned me from the land of Nod. "Come, old chap, we are pulling into Waterloo, and the curtain has not yet fallen on this playlet." It is with chagrin that I confess to a small, nay, mean streak within my nature. For it was pleasing to me that my companion seemed to arise from his seat with a hesitant manner, as though testing the steadiness and capabilities of his extremities. I sprang upright, and it was with the greatest difficulty that I suppressed an exclamation of anguish. But my tottering legs stiffened at the quick glance of surprise, tinged with envy, that the sleuth flashed in my way, while unlatching the compartment door to the high-pitched background music of grating brakes as the train came to a halt. My friend's firm hand on my arm guided me through the station and into a carriage without. Holmes's directions to the sleepy-eyed driver were inaudible to me, but at this point I had lost interest in our next destination. It proved to be a vehicular bridge over the vast checkerboard of Great Eastern rails converging towards the hub that was the transportation empire's London station. Holmes's suggestion that I remain with the carriage was accepted with alacrity. He removed himself to stand on the walk across of the bridge, his eyes in the direction of Surrey. The appearance of his cigarette case and the lighting of one of the Virginia blends that he fancied suggested a lengthy vigil, and I fell asleep again. Possibly it was the sound of an approaching freight or the peculiar tocsin that alerts us in some mysterious manner when action is imminent. But my eyes blinked open to catch Holmes watching the cars of a freight train passing beneath the bridge. At a particular moment his white handkerchief waved in the half-light of the early morning. Since this was obviously a signal for someone positioned further down the line, I now understood the cable that he had taken the pains to dispatch from Lichfield. Not waiting to check the results of his improvised semaphoring, Holmes returned to our carriage, his knuckles rapping on the box. When the trap opened and a bewhiskered and heavy-eyed face peered down, Holmes finally delivered the curtain speech to our nighttime saga. 221B Baker Street, my good man, with all possible speed.